It was just another scorching afternoon on the bustling streets of downtown. The sun blazed overhead, and the air was thick with the smell of sizzling street food. Among the rows of food carts lined up on the sidewalk, Jamal's black hot dog stand stood out, not just because of its vibrant red and yellow umbrella, but because of the man behind it. Jamal had a smile that could brighten anyone's day, and his hot dogs were known to be the best around. People came from all over just to get a taste. It wasn't just about the food, though, it was about Jamal's warmth, his laughter, his stories. He knew his customers by name, remembered their favorite orders, and treated everyone with respect. But that day was different. There was a tension in the air, something Jamal couldn't quite put his finger on. As he wrapped up another hot dog, slathering mustard just the way Mrs. Jenkins liked it, he noticed a police car pull up across the street. Officer Reynolds stepped out, his uniform crisp, sunglasses reflecting the bright sun. Jamal had seen him around before. Reynolds had a reputation, a bad one. People said he was tough, maybe too tough, and he never missed a chance to throw his weight around. Jamal watched as Reynolds leaned against his car, eyes fixed on him, a cold smirk playing on his lips. Trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, Jamal kept working, his hands moving quickly as the lunch rush picked up. But no matter how busy he got, he could feel Reynolds' stare burning into him. It wasn't long before the officer crossed the street, his heavy boots echoing against the pavement. Jamal looked up just as Reynolds reached his cart. "You got a permit for this, boy?" The words were sharp, dripping with contempt. Jamal felt his chest tighten, but he kept his voice steady. "Yes, sir. Got all my paperwork right here." He reached into his apron pocket, pulling out a crumpled set of documents, proof that he had every right to be there. Reynolds barely glanced at the papers before snatching them away, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the details. He shook his head, a mocking laugh escaping his lips. "These look fake to me," he sneered, crumpling the papers even more before shoving them back at Jamal. "Operating without a valid permit, huh? That's a serious offense." Jamal's heart raced. He knew his papers were legit. He double-checked everything when he started his business. But arguing with this cop seemed like a bad idea. I've been here for years," Jamal stammered. "Never had a problem before." Reynolds leaned in closer, his face inches from Jamal's. "Well, there's a problem now," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You people think you can just do whatever you want, huh?" Jamal's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what Reynolds meant by, "you people," but he held his tongue, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'm just trying to make an honest living," Jamal replied, forcing himself to stay calm. "Ain't nothing honest about breaking the law," Reynolds shot back. He stepped behind the cart, pretending to inspect it, knocking over a stack of buns in the process. "This is a health hazard," he declared. "I could shut you down for this." Jamal's eyes widened as Reynolds began tearing through his supplies, deliberately making a mess. "Hey, man, there's no need for that," Jamal protested, his voice rising. Reynolds straightened up, his hand resting on his holster. "You raising your voice at me?" he asked, his tone cold and dangerous. Jamal froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew better than to escalate things. "No, sir," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Just, please, don't destroy my stuff. This is all I have." But his plea fell on deaf ears as Reynolds continued his so-called inspection, throwing hot dogs onto the ground, crushing bags of chips under his boots. Customers who had been watching from a distance began to back away, not wanting to get involved. Jamal felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched his livelihood being ruined before his eyes. "Looks like you're out of business," Reynolds said, a satisfied grin on his face. He turned to leave but then paused, his hand sliding into his pocket. When he pulled it out, there was a wad of cash in his hand. "Almost forgot," he said, waving the money in Jamal's face. "There's a fine for operating without a permit. Gonna need to confiscate your earnings for today." Jamal's stomach dropped. "You can't, that's my rent money," he stammered, panic lacing his words. But Reynolds didn't care. He stuffed the cash into his own pocket, his smile widening. "Maybe next time you'll follow the rules." Without another word, he walked away, leaving Jamal standing there, surrounded by the wreckage of his cart, his dreams shattered. Jamal's hands shook as he sank to his knees, his mind racing. How could this happen? He had done everything right. He played by the rules, worked hard, treated everyone with respect. But none of that mattered, not to someone like Reynolds. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, Jamal sat there, his heart heavy with anger and helplessness. He wanted to fight back, to demand justice, but what chance did he have against a man with a badge and a gun? Yet, deep down, he knew he couldn't let this break him. He wouldn't give Reynolds that satisfaction. Somehow, someway, he would rise from this. But at that moment, as the darkness settled in, all he could do was stare at the ground, the weight of injustice pressing down on him. Little did Jamal know, this was just the beginning. The battle for his dignity, his livelihood, and his freedom was far from over. And what happened next would be something no one could have predicted. That night, Jamal sat alone in his tiny apartment, the silence pressing in on him. His hands were still shaking as he counted the little money he had left, barely enough to get through the week. His cart was ruined, his supplies destroyed, and the day's earnings stolen right in front of him. It wasn't just about the money, though. It was about his dignity, his hard work, his dreams. He felt violated, humiliated, powerless. He'd always believed that if you worked hard and treated people right, things would work out. But today shattered that belief. He replayed the incident over and over in his mind, anger and frustration bubbling up each time he remembered Reynolds' smug grin. How could someone with so much power use it to hurt others without a second thought? Jamal felt the sting of injustice deep in his chest. But more than that, he felt a growing sense of fear. What if Reynolds came back? What if he decided that today's damage wasn't enough? Jamal shivered, rubbing his hands over his face, trying to shake off the anxiety gnawing at him. He thought about his mother, the woman who'd taught him everything about kindness, resilience, and hard work. She'd always told him, keep your head high, no matter what. Don't let anyone steal your pride. But how could he hold his head high after today? How could he face his customers, his friends, knowing he'd been reduced to nothing by one man's cruelty? His phone buzzed, breaking the heavy silence. It was a message from Tony, his best friend since childhood. Hey man, heard what happened. You good? Jamal hesitated, his fingers hovering over the screen. He didn't feel like talking, didn't want to admit how helpless he felt. But Tony was persistent. Come by the shop tomorrow. Let's figure this out, the next message read. Jamal sighed, his shoulders slumping. At least he wasn't alone. Tony always had his back, no matter what. And right now, he needed someone in his corner. The next morning, Jamal made his way to Tony's barbershop, his feet dragging with every step. The bell above the door jingled as he walked in, the familiar smell of hair products and aftershave filling the air. Tony looked up from his chair, his face a mix of concern and anger. Man, I can't believe that cop did you like that, he said, his voice tight with frustration. People been talking, they saw everything. Jamal's heart sank. He didn't want to be a charity case, didn't want people's pity. But Tony's hand on his shoulder was firm, grounding. You did nothing wrong, Jamal. This ain't on you. Jamal slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. I don't know what to do, man. He took everything. My cart's trashed, and he took my money. How am I supposed to pay rent? Tony's jaw tightened, his fists clenching. That dude's a bully. Always has been. Heard stories about him harassing folks for no reason. But this is too far. He paced the room, his mind racing. We gotta do something. You can't just let him get away with this. Jamal looked up, his eyes hollow. And do what? Go to the cops? You think they'll listen to me over him? The bitterness in his voice was sharp. He'd heard enough stories to know how the system worked, how people like Reynolds got away with anything. Tony paused, his expression softening. You're right. Going to the station would be useless. But that doesn't mean we just sit here and do nothing. Tony's words hung in the air, a spark of hope flickering in Jamal's chest. But fear quickly snuffed it out. I don't want more trouble, Jamal whispered, his voice cracking. What if he comes after me again? I can't go through that again. Tony's face softened, his shoulders relaxing as he sat next to Jamal. I get it, man. I really do. But if we don't stand up now, he's just gonna keep doing this, to you, to others. We gotta make some noise. Let people know what he did. Jamal's eyes widened. You mean, go public? The thought made his stomach twist. Putting himself out there, sharing his humiliation for the world to see, it felt too raw, too vulnerable. But Tony's gaze was steady, unwavering. Yeah, people need to know the truth. Maybe if enough folks see what he's doing, something'll change. Jamal hesitated, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. He wanted justice, but he was terrified of the consequences. Just then, the bell above the door chimed again, and an older woman walked in. It was Mrs. Jenkins, one of Jamal's regular customers. Her eyes widened when she saw him. "Oh, Jamal, I've been worried sick since yesterday. I saw what that officer did. It was downright evil." She reached out, her hands trembling as she gripped his. "You don't deserve that. Nobody does." Her voice cracked with emotion, her eyes shining with tears. "I've known you for years, and you're one of the hardest working young men I've ever met. That man is a disgrace to his badge." Hearing those words broke something inside Jamal. He'd been holding back his pain, his anger, his fear, but now it all came rushing out. His shoulders shook as he tried to keep himself together, his jaw clenched tight. Mrs. Jenkins hugged him, her frail arms surprisingly strong. "Don't you let him break you, Jamal. You hear me? Don't you let him win." Tony's voice was quiet but firm. "She's right, man. You got people who care about you, who know the truth. We can do this together." Jamal looked at them, really looked, and for the first time since that awful afternoon, he felt a flicker of strength. Maybe Tony was right. Maybe they could fight back. But how? What could they possibly do to stand up to someone like Reynolds? The question spun in his mind, but one thing was certain, he wasn't alone. And that was a start. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs, steadying his nerves. "All right," he said, his voice firming up. "Let's do this. Let's tell the world what really happened." As he spoke, a spark of determination ignited within him. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be safe, but Jamal knew he couldn't let fear silence him. Not anymore. He wouldn't let Reynolds take that power away from him. Not again. But little did he know, taking a stand would only be the beginning. The storm was far from over, and the fight for justice would push him to his limits. And what happened next would be more shocking than he could ever imagine. Word spread fast. By the end of the week, everyone in the neighborhood knew what had happened to Jamal. People whispered in hushed tones, their faces tight with anger and concern. It wasn't just about the ruined hot dog cart or the stolen money. It was about what it represented: abuse of power, prejudice, and fear. Many had their own stories about Officer Reynolds, tales of intimidation and harassment that they'd kept to themselves out of fear of retaliation. But seeing what happened to Jamal brought those memories rushing back, and the community was tired of staying silent. With Tony's help, Jamal decided to take his story to social media. They filmed a short video in the barbershop, Jamal's hands shaking as he recounted what happened. He kept his voice steady, refusing to let his fear show, even as his heart raced. "I'm not looking for pity," he said, his eyes locked on the camera. "I just want justice. I want to keep my business running without being harassed. That's all." Tony uploaded the video, tagging local news outlets and community leaders. Neither of them expected much to come of it, but at least Jamal was telling his truth. The video went viral overnight. People shared it thousands of times, their comments filled with outrage and support. "This isn't right," one person wrote. "Cops like that shouldn't be on the streets." Another commented, "I've seen this officer around. He's bad news. Glad someone's finally speaking up." The outpouring of support was overwhelming, and for the first time in days, Jamal felt a glimmer of hope. But that hope was short-lived. 2 days later, Jamal woke up to find his apartment building surrounded by squad cars. Panic seized him as he looked out the window and saw Officer Reynolds standing on the sidewalk, his arms crossed, his expression cold and calculating. There was no mistaking the threat in his eyes. A loud knock echoed through his apartment, making him jump. Jamal's hands shook as he opened the door, coming face to face with 2 other officers. "Jamal Thompson?" one of them asked, his voice flat. Jamal nodded, his heart pounding. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and making false claims against an officer of the law." The words didn't make sense. False claims? Obstruction? Jamal's mind raced, his body going numb as the officers grabbed his wrists and cuffed him. "Wait, I didn't do anything," he protested, struggling as they pulled him out of his apartment. But no one listened. As they shoved him into the back of a squad car, he caught Reynolds' smirk, the gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. It was payback, plain and simple. And there was nothing Jamal could do about it. News of Jamal's arrest spread just as quickly as his video had. But this time, the reactions were mixed. Some people believed him, outraged that he was being targeted for speaking out. Others weren't so sure. Maybe he was lying, one comment read. "You never know these days." Another said, if he's innocent, why'd they arrest him? The doubt stung, and as Jamal sat in a cold, cramped cell, he wondered if he'd made a huge mistake by going public. Tony was furious. He marched down to the police station, demanding to see Jamal, but they turned him away. He's under investigation, they said, their faces blank, their eyes cold. Tony stormed out, his blood boiling. This was exactly what they were afraid of. Reynolds using his power to silence Jamal, to make an example out of him. But Tony wasn't about to back down. He contacted a local activist group known for fighting against police corruption. They agreed to help, organizing a protest outside the station, chanting for Jamal's release. Justice for Jamal, they shouted, their voices echoing through the streets. The protest grew larger by the hour, drawing people from all over the city. News cameras showed up, reporters scrambling to cover the story. Reynolds watched from inside the station, his jaw clenched. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He thought arresting Jamal would shut him up, but it only made the situation worse. His superiors were breathing down his neck, asking questions he didn't have answers to. He had to get control of this before it spiraled even more out of hand. Jamal sat alone in his cell, his head resting against the cold wall. His body ached from sleeping on the hard bench, his eyes stinging from lack of sleep. He couldn't believe this was happening. Just days ago, he was running his hot dog stand, living his life, minding his own business. Now, he was behind bars, his name dragged through the mud, his future uncertain. Fear gripped him, but so did anger. Reynolds wanted him to be afraid, wanted him to feel powerless. But Jamal wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Not this time. Meanwhile, Tony was working behind the scenes, gathering witnesses who had seen the incident at the hot dog stand. Mrs. Jenkins was the first to agree, her voice shaking with emotion as she recounted what she saw. That officer was out of control, she said, her eyes flashing with anger. He destroyed Jamal's cart, stole his money, and humiliated him for no reason. It was wrong. Others came forward too, their voices strong, their stories consistent. With the help of the activist group, Tony compiled their statements, passing them along to a local lawyer known for taking on tough cases. This isn't going to be easy, the lawyer warned, his face grim. We're up against a system designed to protect its own. But if we can prove that Reynolds lied, that he targeted Jamal out of spite, we might stand a chance. It was a small hope, but it was enough to keep Tony going. Inside his cell, Jamal heard the distant chants of the protesters, their voices echoing through the halls. Justice for Jamal, they shouted, their words a lifeline that pulled him out of his despair. People were fighting for him, risking their safety to stand up against injustice. He wasn't alone, not anymore. And that thought gave him strength. But Reynolds wasn't done yet. He watched the protest with cold eyes, his hands clenched into fists. If Jamal thought he was going to win, he was dead wrong. Reynolds still had his badge, his power, his connections. And he was ready to use them to make sure Jamal never saw the light of day again. He'd bury this kid so deep, no one would remember his name. The battle was far from over, and the stakes were getting higher. Jamal was fighting for his freedom, his dignity, his very existence. But Reynolds was fighting to protect his power, his reputation, his career. And in his eyes, no one, especially not someone like Jamal, was going to take that away from him. The war was just beginning, and the next move would be the most dangerous one yet. Days turned into weeks, and Jamal was still behind bars, waiting for his day in court. Every minute felt like an eternity as he sat alone in his cell, his thoughts spiraling between fear and determination. He missed his freedom, his cart, his customers. He missed the sun on his face and the laughter of children playing near his stand. But most of all, he missed feeling safe, feeling human. The cold walls and metal bars reminded him constantly of how powerless he was. But he refused to let them break his spirit. He held on to the hope that truth would prevail, even when everything felt hopeless. Outside the jail, the protests continued, growing larger and louder each day. People from all walks of life came together, holding signs demanding justice, their voices echoing through the streets. Free Jamal, they chanted, their determination unwavering. The community was tired of living in fear, tired of staying silent. They wanted change, and they weren't going to stop until they got it. Tony was at the front of every protest, his voice hoarse but fierce, his loyalty to Jamal driving him forward. The pressure was mounting on the police department, and Reynolds felt it more than anyone. Reporters hounded him, asking questions he couldn't answer. His superiors were demanding explanations, warning him to clean up the mess he'd made. But instead of backing down, Reynolds doubled down. He planted evidence to strengthen his case against Jamal, fabricating lies to make him look guilty. It was risky, but Reynolds was desperate. He couldn't let this kid ruin his career, his reputation. He was willing to do whatever it took to bury the truth. Meanwhile, Tony and the activist group worked tirelessly, gathering more evidence, interviewing witnesses, and spreading the word on social media. Videos from bystanders who had recorded the incident started to surface, showing Reynolds destroying Jamal's cart and taking his money. The footage was blurry, but the truth was clear. People were outraged, their anger fueling the movement. Jamal's story became a symbol of the community's fight against injustice, their voices growing louder with each passing day. Inside his cell, Jamal heard the chants outside, his heart aching with gratitude. He couldn't believe so many people were standing up for him, risking their safety to fight for his freedom. It gave him strength, reminding him that he wasn't alone. But the fear was still there, gnawing at him every night as he lay on the cold, hard bench. He didn't know if he'd ever get out, if he'd ever be free again. And that uncertainty was suffocating. Then, one evening, a guard came to his cell, his face stern. "You got a visitor," he grunted, unlocking the door. Jamal's heart raced as he was led to the visitation room. When he walked in, his eyes widened in shock. Sitting at the table was a woman he'd never seen before, her posture poised, her expression serious. "My name is Angela Thompson," she said, extending her hand. "I'm your lawyer." Tony had hired her with the help of the activist group, pooling donations from the community to pay for her services. Angela was sharp, confident, and relentless, a fighter who wasn't afraid to take on powerful opponents. She sat across from Jamal, her gaze steady. "I've gone through the evidence," she began, her voice calm but firm. "And it's clear that you were targeted. We have witnesses, video footage, and a mountain of inconsistencies in Officer Reynolds' reports. We have a case, Jamal. But it won't be easy." Jamal's hope flickered, fragile but growing. "You really think we can win?" he asked, his voice trembling. Angela's eyes softened. "We're up against a corrupt system, and Reynolds is playing dirty. But I believe in the truth. And I believe in you." Her words filled Jamal with a courage he hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time since his arrest, he saw a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. But Angela warned him of the challenges ahead. Reynolds wasn't going to back down without a fight. He'd do everything in his power to discredit Jamal, to twist the narrative and make him look guilty. "We need to be prepared for anything," she said, her jaw set in determination. "He's already planted false evidence. If we don't expose him first, he'll use it to destroy you in court." Jamal's stomach churned at the thought of Reynolds' lies, the fear creeping back in. But he nodded, his resolve hardening. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady. "I won't let him win." Angela's lips curved into a small smile. "Good, because this fight is just getting started." As they prepared for the trial, the tension in the city grew thicker. The protests became more intense, with clashes breaking out between activists and the police. The community was divided. Some stood with Jamal, demanding justice, while others sided with Reynolds, convinced that Jamal was lying. The media coverage was relentless, reporters sensationalizing every detail, twisting the narrative to boost their ratings. It felt like the whole world was watching, waiting to see who would come out on top. Reynolds watched it all unfold, his anger boiling over. He never expected things to get this out of hand. But now his career, his reputation, and his power were all on the line. He couldn't afford to lose. Not to Jamal. Not to anyone. Desperation drove him to take even more drastic measures, manipulating evidence, intimidating witnesses, and pulling strings behind the scenes. He was willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way, no matter the cost. Jamal could feel the walls closing in, the pressure suffocating. But he refused to give up. With Angela by his side and the community fighting for him, he knew he had to keep going. He owed it to himself, to his mother's memory, to everyone who believed in him. He had to prove his innocence, not just for himself but for everyone who'd ever been wronged by people like Reynolds. The court date loomed closer, the tension reaching a breaking point. The stakes were higher than ever, and the outcome was far from certain. Jamal was facing the fight of his life, and one wrong move could destroy everything. But he was ready to face his fears, to stand up for the truth, no matter the cost. He was ready to fight back. But as the trial approached, new secrets began to surface, revealing the depths of Reynolds' corruption. And the truth was more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The battle was just beginning, and the most dangerous chapter was yet to come. As the trial date approached, the pressure was unbearable. Jamal could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders, his heart pounding every time he thought about stepping into that courtroom. The fear was relentless, but so was his determination. He wouldn't let Reynolds win. Not after everything he'd been through, not after all the people who were fighting for him. But deep down, he knew the odds were stacked against him. Reynolds had power, connections, and a badge that shielded him from the consequences of his actions. Jamal was just a hot dog vendor fighting to clear his name. It seemed impossible, but he had to try. Angela worked tirelessly, piecing together the case, scrutinizing every detail. She stayed up late, combing through police reports, cross-referencing witness statements, and preparing Jamal for the grueling questions he'd face on the stand. "They're going to try to break you," she warned, her eyes intense. "They'll twist your words, attack your character, and do everything they can to make you look guilty. But you have to stay calm, tell the truth, and don't let them shake you." Jamal nodded, swallowing his fear. He had no choice but to be strong. The day of the trial finally arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the halls, their cameras flashing, their microphones shoved into people's faces as they scrambled for statements. The tension was palpable, the air heavy with anticipation. Jamal's heart raced as he sat at the defense table, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He glanced over at Reynolds, who sat across the room, his face a mask of arrogance and confidence. The man looked untouchable, his uniform pristine, his posture perfect. It was infuriating. The prosecutor wasted no time painting Jamal as a liar and a troublemaker, someone who was trying to ruin a good officer's career for attention and money. They called witnesses who testified against him, people who claimed to have seen him acting aggressively toward Reynolds, twisting the narrative to make him look like the villain. Jamal's blood boiled as he listened to the lies, his nails digging into his palms. But he kept his mouth shut, just like Angela told him to. He couldn't afford to lose his temper, no matter how badly he wanted to defend himself. Then, Reynolds took the stand, his demeanor calm and composed. He lied effortlessly, recounting his version of events with a straight face, his voice steady and confident. "I approached him politely," he said, his eyes cold. "But he became aggressive, yelling at me and resisting my orders. I had no choice but to confiscate his earnings and property as evidence." Jamal felt sick to his stomach, rage bubbling inside him. But he didn't say a word, his jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. Angela cross-examined Reynolds, her questions sharp and relentless. She pointed out inconsistencies in his report, exposed his history of complaints, and presented the video footage that contradicted his story. But Reynolds remained calm, deflecting every accusation with practiced ease. He was a seasoned officer who knew how to play the game, and he played it well. The jury looked conflicted, their expressions unreadable. The doubt was there, but so was the hesitation. Would they believe a street vendor over a decorated cop? The turning point came when Tony uncovered something shocking. He had been digging into Reynolds' past, desperate to find anything that could help Jamal. And then he found it. A witness who had seen everything that day but was too scared to come forward. Her name was Rosa Alvarez, a young mother who had been walking by with her child when she saw Reynolds attack Jamal. She'd been afraid to speak up, fearing retaliation, but after seeing the protests and watching Jamal's story unfold, she knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. Angela brought Rosa to the stand, her voice gentle as she asked her to recount what she saw. Rosa's hands trembled, her voice shaking as she spoke. "I saw the officer yelling at him," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. Jamal wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just working, selling hot dogs. But the officer, he was so angry. He knocked over the cart and took his money. Jamal tried to reason with him, but the officer just kept shouting, calling him names, hateful names. Her words hung heavy in the air, the courtroom silent as everyone absorbed the impact. Reynolds' face went pale, his confidence faltering. He hadn't expected this. No one had. It was a turning point, a crack in his perfect facade. Angela pressed further, asking Rosa if she was sure of what she saw. "I'm positive," Rosa said firmly, her fear replaced with courage. I was afraid to speak up before, but I can't stay quiet anymore. What that officer did was wrong, and Jamal didn't deserve it. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the jury's faces filled with shock and contemplation. It was the first time they'd heard the full story, untainted by lies or manipulation. And it was devastating. Jamal felt tears sting his eyes, his chest tightening with a mix of relief and gratitude. Someone had finally spoken the truth. He wasn't alone in this fight. But Reynolds wasn't done yet. Desperation took over, his arrogance crumbling as he realized his carefully constructed lie was falling apart. He leaned over to his lawyer, whispering furiously, his eyes darting around the courtroom. Jamal watched him, a chill running down his spine. He knew that look. Reynolds was planning something big. And it wasn't going to be good. Angela noticed it too, her eyes narrowing. She leaned closer to Jamal, her voice low. "Stay alert," she whispered. "He's going to make a move. I don't know what, but he's desperate. We need to be ready for anything." Jamal's heart raced, his body tensing. He could feel the danger looming, the threat hanging heavy in the air. Reynolds was backed into a corner, his lies exposed, his power slipping through his fingers. And that made him more dangerous than ever. He was willing to do whatever it took to protect himself, no matter who got hurt in the process. The stakes were higher than ever, the tension unbearable. Jamal was closer to justice than he'd ever been, but the fight was far from over. And the next move could change everything. The courtroom was tense, every eye fixed on Reynolds as he sat at the witness stand, his face pale and his hands trembling. The once confident officer now looked cornered, his lies unraveling before him. Rose's testimony had shaken him, her courage piercing through the web of deceit he had spun. Jamal watched with bated breath, his heart pounding as he saw the cracks forming in Reynolds' armor. But he knew it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Angela seized the moment, standing tall as she approached the witness stand, her eyes locked on Reynolds. "Officer Reynolds," she began, her voice calm but firm, "you testified that Jamal was aggressive and resisted arrest. Yet multiple witnesses, including video evidence, contradict your version of events. Why should the jury believe you?" Her question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Reynolds shifted in his seat, his confidence visibly shaken. But he forced a smile, his voice smooth as he replied, "With all due respect, people see what they want to see." Emotions were high, and sometimes memories get distorted. "I did my job by the book." His words were calculated, his tone steady, but there was a crack in his composure, a flicker of fear in his eyes. Angela didn't back down. "By the book?" she echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Is that why you destroyed his cart? Confiscated his money without filing it as evidence?" She paused, letting the questions sink in before continuing. "Or is that why you failed to mention in your report that Jamal was recording you on his phone?" The courtroom went silent, a wave of shock washing over the crowd. Jamal's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had completely forgotten about his phone. In the chaos of the arrest, it had been knocked out of his hand. He never saw it again. Reynolds' face turned ghostly white, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. Angela's eyes gleamed with determination as she pulled a plastic evidence bag from her briefcase. Inside was Jamal's phone, its screen cracked but intact. This phone was found in the evidence locker, unlogged and hidden. "It took a subpoena to retrieve it," Angela explained, her voice steady. "Let's see what it has to say." She handed the phone to the technician who connected it to the courtroom's monitor. The screen flickered to life, showing a video recorded from Jamal's cart. The footage was shaky, but the audio was clear. It showed Reynolds approaching Jamal, his voice laced with hostility. "You people don't belong here," he sneered, his hand shoving the cart. The crowd gasped, eyes widening in shock. It was undeniable proof of Reynolds' prejudice, his abuse of power. The video continued, showing Jamal pleading with him, trying to reason peacefully. But Reynolds grew more aggressive, knocking over the cart and grabbing the cash. His lies were laid bare for everyone to see. Reynolds' face flushed red, his hands shaking as he realized the enormity of his mistake. He stammered, that video is fake. It's edited to make me look bad." But his voice wavered, the fear evident. The jury watched him, their expressions hardening. They didn't believe him. Not anymore. Angela's voice was cold as she delivered the final blow. "The video has been authenticated. It's real, Officer Reynolds. Just like the truth you tried so hard to bury." She turned to the judge. Your Honor, the defense rests. The room was electric, the tension so thick it was hard to breathe. Reynolds looked defeated, his head hanging low. He knew he was finished. But just when everyone thought it was over, Reynolds did the unthinkable. In a desperate attempt to salvage his crumbling world, he lunged at Jamal, his face twisted in rage. "This is all your fault," he shouted, his voice cracking with fury. "You ruined me." The courtroom erupted into chaos, security rushing in to restrain him. But the damage was done. The world saw his true colors, his hatred, his corruption. There was no hiding from the truth anymore. Jamal stood frozen, his heart pounding as he watched Reynolds being dragged away, kicking and screaming. It felt surreal, like a nightmare finally ending. He could barely process what had just happened. But as the noise died down and the judge regained control, the reality began to sink in. He was free. The truth had finally set him free. The jury didn't take long to deliberate. They returned with a unanimous verdict, not guilty. The room erupted into cheers, tears streaming down Jamal's face as he broke down, relief washing over him. Tony rushed over, pulling him into a tight hug, his voice choked with emotion. "We did it, man. You're going home." Jamal could hardly believe it. After everything he'd been through, after all the pain and fear, justice had finally prevailed. But the story didn't end there. As Jamal walked out of the courthouse, the sun warm on his face, he saw the crowd waiting for him. The community that had fought for him, stood by him, believed in him even when the world tried to tear him down. They cheered, their faces lit up with joy and pride. Jamal felt his heart swell, his gratitude overwhelming. He realized then that this fight wasn't just about him. It was about all of them. The people who were oppressed, silenced, and mistreated. People who were fighting for dignity, respect, and equality. Reynolds was charged with corruption, falsifying evidence, and abuse of power. His fall from grace was swift and brutal, his reputation destroyed, his career over. But Jamal didn't feel any satisfaction in his downfall. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted peace. And now, he finally had it. He returned to his neighborhood, his community welcoming him back with open arms. They helped him rebuild his cart, even better than before. He went back to selling hot dogs, back to the life he loved. But he was different now, stronger, braver, wiser. He had faced injustice and stood his ground, refusing to be broken. And he knew that his story would inspire others to do the same. Jamal smiled as he handed a hot dog to a little boy, his heart full of hope. He had won his freedom, his dignity, his truth. And that was more powerful than any lie ever could be. The fight wasn't over, not for him, not for his community. But they were ready. They were strong. And together, they were unstoppable. In the days following the trial, Jamal felt a weight lift off his shoulders, a heaviness he'd been carrying for far too long. He could finally breathe again, the air tasting sweeter, the sun feeling warmer on his face. It was over. He was free. But even as he tried to settle back into his life, the world around him had changed. People recognized him on the street, some stopping to shake his hand, others offering words of support and admiration. He had become a symbol of resilience, a voice for justice, even though all he ever wanted was to live his life in peace. Tony stayed by his side through it all, his loyalty unshakable. "You did it, man," Tony said one afternoon, leaning against the newly painted hot dog cart. "You stood up to him. To all of them. You made them see the truth." Jamal looked at his friend, his heart full of gratitude. "I didn't do it alone," he replied, his voice soft. "I couldn't have made it without you, without Angela, without everyone who believed in me." The community had rallied behind him in a way he never imagined. People from all walks of life had come together, united by the fight for justice. They had marched, chanted, and demanded accountability. And in the end, they had won. Jamal realized then that his story was bigger than just one man's struggle. It was about hope, courage, and the power of unity. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds were against you. Angela visited him often, her fierce determination giving way to a warm smile whenever she saw him working the cart again. "Back to selling the best hot dogs in the city, huh?" she teased, her eyes sparkling. Jamal grinned, flipping a sizzling sausage on the grill. Some things never change. But there was a difference now. People came not just for the hot dogs, but for his story. They wanted to shake his hand, to thank him for his courage, to tell him how much his fight had meant to them. One afternoon, Rosa stopped by with her little girl. Her eyes were bright, her shoulders relaxed. She looked different, happier, lighter. Jamal's heart warmed at the sight. "Rosa," he said, his voice full of emotion. "Thank you. You didn't have to do what you did, but you changed everything." She smiled softly, her eyes glistening. "I did what was right. You inspired me to be brave." They hugged, a silent promise passing between them. They would always have each other's backs. News of Reynolds' conviction spread quickly. He was sentenced to prison for his corruption and abuse of power, his reputation shattered. It didn't bring Jamal joy, but it did bring closure. The system wasn't perfect, but in this case, justice was served. Jamal could finally let go of the anger, the pain, the fear. He could move on, but he didn't forget. He couldn't. Instead, he chose to use his experience to help others. He spoke at community meetings, shared his story at schools, and even joined local organizations advocating for police reform and justice. His voice mattered now, and he wasn't going to waste it. If his fight could help prevent someone else from going through the same ordeal, it was worth it. The neighborhood changed, too. People were more vigilant, more united. They looked out for each other, supported each other, and made sure no one faced injustice alone. It wasn't just about one corrupt officer. It was about building a community that stood together, no matter what. Jamal's business thrived, the support pouring in from every corner. His hot dog cart became a symbol of resilience and hope, a place where people gathered not just for food but for connection and conversation. He hired local kids to help out, giving them a safe space and a chance to learn about hard work and perseverance. It wasn't just about selling hot dogs anymore. It was about giving back, about lifting others up just as he had been lifted. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Jamal stood by his cart, watching the world move around him. He saw families laughing, friends sharing meals, people smiling as they walked by. His heart swelled with gratitude. He had fought, he had struggled, but he had survived. And now, he was thriving. Tony joined him, handing him a soda with a grin. "Looks like we made it, huh?" Jamal chuckled, taking a sip. "Yeah, we did." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the sunset, their hearts full of hope. The fight wasn't over. There was still work to be done, still battles to be fought. But they were ready. Together, they could face anything. As the evening breeze rustled through the streets, Jamal took a deep breath, his soul at peace. He had his freedom, his dignity, his voice. And no one could ever take that away from him again. The journey had been long and painful, but it had made him stronger, braver, and more determined than ever. He was no longer just a hot dog vendor. He was a survivor, a fighter, a beacon of hope. And his story was far from over. With a smile, he turned to Tony. "Ready to close up shop?" Tony grinned. "Yeah, man. Let's go home." And as they walked away, laughter echoing down the street, Jamal knew he was exactly where he was meant to be, home, free, and finally at peace.